We need to create a concrete class of the input manager. We need to add that as a member to our game class, and then we need to create an entity that actually uses this new controller or input member. The first thing I'm going to do though is change this to a concrete class, because I realized I want to be able to have a null object of this type. Let me show you why. When I go to game, and let's see, we are creating a level here, so let's just make a private input manager controls. Let's bring that class in and make sure that you pick our input manager, not the hardware input from the Android system. I don't want this to be null because I want to reliably know that this always exists. So that if the game is running, there is a controller of some type. So I'm going to default this to simply input manager, right? That's safe. It has no actions, takes no actions, no behavior, and the values are all defaulted as well. So this way I can actually go ahead and implement this without ever providing a controller to the game, and nothing bad will happen. So we have controls up here. I need a getter and a setter. So I'm gonna make those. Actually, let's put them next to the other getters and setters. Here's get world and get heights. So let's do public input manager, get controls, return that. That will always exist. And then public void set controls, final input manager controls. Now I could just assign our member the new controls, but we need to give them a chance to stop themselves and clean up. So whenever this happens, I'm going to call on the existing controls and let it do on pause and on stop, just for good measure. We'll notice later if this needs to change depending on what our actual implementations end up being. But let's stop and pause and then assign the new control. And potentially that also needs to get a call for on resume. I'm not exactly sure. Let's leave it like this and then we'll see when we get to the concrete implementations. But what we do know is we have a few lifecycle callbacks that we can also implement. So we have a getter and a setter. Let's go down to the lifecycles. Here is a on resume. So controls on resume, and then we have an on pause, controls on pause, and in on destroy I'm gonna make sure that we call on pause, on stop. Actually, no, the other life cycles have already taken care of it. I'm just gonna set this to null. We're done there. Speaking of on destroy, by the way, I just realized that in the constructor of our game class, I'm adding myself as a listener to our holder here, add callback. We never deregister. That's a bad habit. I don't think it matters much in this case because we will be destroyed anyway, but let's make sure that we behave like adults. So I'm going to go back to on destroy down here, and at the end of everything, just grab the holder and do remove callback so that we actually clean up after ourselves properly. So that gives us everything we need in the game class. We need the concrete implementation here though. So I'm going to go back to that article on dealing with user input, week 4, managing user input. I've updated this now, by the way, to take our new code standard, or rather this year's code standard, into account. So I'm now using better named members, and it's a concrete class, so you don't have to do that change if you copied. I want the touch controller class. I'm gonna grab that, go back to the project, and on input add a new Java class, touch controller. Let me double check the naming there. Touch controller. It extends the input manager, our input manager, not the Android one. Zoom in, add that stuff. And immediately it complains because we don't have the view and I don't have import R. Import the motion event, and then make sure that the naming is consistent. So let me go to the input manager, do some refactoring here. Vertical factor. I'm doing refactoring just to make sure I don't actually have these typed up anywhere else. Not generate refactor. I should learn that shortcut because I tend to use it a lot. Is jumping. There we go. Okay. So back to, let's see, main activity is probably where we want to create this. We have, so touch controller takes a view as an argument. Sorry, here's the constructor. It takes a view. And that's the view we create in touch controls. It is called touch control. That's the ID where we create it. So if we go to our main activity, we should be able to do something like input manager control equals touch controller. We need to bring that class in, and we give it find view by ID, RID touch control. This is complaining because the constructor is not public. Shameful. Let's make it public. That looks all right. Back to main activity. So we have the controls objects, and then we can give it to the game. Set controls, controls. And then at some point later, the game is going to start. It will be resumed. We will resume our whatever, and so on and so forth. So let me just make sure that onResume is called properly. I'm pretty sure it is. OnResume, yeah. Sweet. So how do we use this? We need to create a new entity. I want a player, and I want it to extend the dynamic entity. And I already have a player that we copied from the previous game, so I'm just going to start in this class. I'm going to start with changing this out for dynamic entity. And then I'm going to remove all of this and the health. And I want that to be public, probably. I don't need on collision just yet. Only the update. All right. So first things first, we want to grab the input manager from the... Oh, that's not what I wanted at all. The input manager from the game. So controls. Get controls. There we go. Let me just clean up this. So from the controls, we can read what direction the user is pressing. So we can do final float, direction, equals, controls, and that's the horizontal factor. So to get a new velocity value, and this is from the dynamic entity, of course, we're inheriting the member, we simply do the direction, which is between -1 and +1. It's a float, so it can be any value in between there. And then multiply that with basically our max speed. So if it's fully to the right, if it's a +1, then our velocity will simply be our max speed. And vice versa if we're moving to the left. And if we are having an analog input, it might be, 0.5, then we will be moving at half our top speed. So we need something like a play run speed setting. Let's create that. So static final float play run speed, and let's do 6 meters per second. Right? 6 floats, 6 whatever. We also want to maybe support jumping. So if the controls tells that the player is trying to jump and we are currently on ground, that's again a member that we inherit from dynamic entity, we can conceivably jump. Now a jump is simply a negative velocity on the y-axis. So we're gonna need some sort of jump force, and it needs to be somewhat commensurate with the gravity. So let's call that jump force or impulse or whatever you want. I'm gonna have that be a negative value because we want to move upwards. And I'm just gonna use the gravity from our parent class and a fraction of it, so maybe divide by 2. You're just gonna have to play with this. It's not really meters per second, it's whatever feels good. This comes down to just gameplay. But with a jump force, we can now try to modify our velocity. So velocity y equals the player jump force. We don't need to scale it. And also we want to set is on ground to false at this point. Lastly, we call the superclass to let it continue with the rest of the update. So we take the direction, we integrate that into our velocity. We might modify the y velocity if we're jumping, and then we tell dynamic entity, do your thing. Dynamic entity takes over. It applies velocities on the x-axis, it checks if we're on ground or not, and applies gravity. Then it integrates the y velocity. Then it checks if we need to respawn. This should probably not be here, right? But it's a debug tool, so let's just live with it. Don't need this to be random, actually. I can just respawn at the top of the world. So what's next? We don't currently spawn a player. That's an issue. So let's go to the level manager. In create entity, if the sprite name equals the player, create a player. That's neat. And while we're here, we might as well create a player member as well, so we can reach this thing from the rest of the game code later on. So among our entities, I'm going to make a public player, set it to null. And so when we create this player, equals E, you should probably have an assert here to make sure that it's null before you overwrite it. If it's not null, you should throw an assertion or something, because you shouldn't have more than one player per level. What's going on? Required player found entity. Right, so we need to cast that. Can I do that? Oh, nice, it worked. Then in our cleanup, we want to make sure that we null that reference as well. So we destroy all entities, we clear that, we clear the player. Maybe not do that in cleanup, actually. Let's do that in destroy. Hang on, wait. Cleanup is called at load map assets. That's going to load another player. Yeah, we assume that all entities have been destroyed. So cleanup, entities clear, players null. We could have a stronger check on this, but for now this is going to be fine, just to let the player access this thing when it needs to. The game, sorry. And yeah, I'm not going to worry about it just yet. So, the player should be spawned. Let's start the game, see what's going on. Also, let me check the time. All right. Go, go, go. All right. Nice. There we go. Let's try some jumping. Also nice. Now, of course, it's slightly fugly that the character is not turning around when I'm walking backwards, and it's very hard to test this in the emulator because I can't click all the buttons at the same time. So you're gonna have to load this onto your phone and actually try it. We want it probably to turn towards the direction we're moving, but this video is already getting long, so I'm just gonna make a short follow-up to this to show you how to turn the sprite. You already know how to turn the sprite. You have the matrix when rendering, in dynamic entity anyway. Where is it? It's not rendering, it's only the entity that renders, whatever. You have the matrix, you can use the matrix to render the sprite flipped, that frame. Let me show you in another video. I'm gonna stop that and see you soon.